Good afternoon, everyone. This is Leanne Bryan from the National Center on Subsidy Innovation and Accountability. It is exactly 3 o'clock, at least by my PC. So we are going to go ahead and get started. Katie is running the slides for us. But welcome to our webinar, Year 2 Error Rate Training, Successfully Completing Reviews, and the ACF404 Improper Payments Report. We have 17 Year 2 states completing reviews, and this webinar is going to share helpful information as you start compiling your case review data and preparing your report for submission. These lovely faces are your error rate team here at the Subsidy Center. Janae Broadway is the error rate specialist for Region 7. That's me in the middle, Leanne Bryan, error rate specialist for Region 1. And Katie Watts is our error rate lead and error rate specialist for all other regions. From the Office of Child Care Central Office, both ACF404 and Linda Winings provide ongoing support and guidance to our states. And today, both Linda and Adi, yep, there's Adi, are joining to offer their error rate experience and expertise. We also want to acknowledge OCC regional offices on the call. So I'm looking at the list here. I see quite a few program specialists and program managers. Thank you for joining and sticking with us here throughout the error rate journey. Moving to the agenda, Janae is going to get us started talking through the online data collection system, including logging into and navigating the 404 within the system. Katie's going to talk through the different parts of the 404 report and tips on completing each of the required items. We'll wrap up the training with next steps. And while we plan on having time at the end for questions, we're also going to pause throughout the training to allow for questions and answers as they come up today. Before we jump into the OLDC, let's take a quick look at the Year 2 timeline. If we move down to row 4, we're almost at the finish line and submitting the State Improper Payments Report, or ACF404. This report is due June 30th, so what's that, 35 days from now? And today's webinar is going to focus on that 404 report. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Janae to talk us through getting started with the OLDC.
Awesome, thanks, Leanne. All right, so let's begin with logging into OLDC. So many of you will be working on the 404 report in the OLDC, will likely already have at least some experience with the site from either previous cycles or from entering and submitting the SDAP this cycle. So for some of you, this will be a review. However, if you are new to OLDC, you will need to request access. To request access, there's a form to be completed, and I believe Katie sent the request form out to all registrants prior to the webinar. But just in case you didn't receive it or you can't find it, locate it in an email, we do have the form available in the handout sections of this webinar. You will need to return the completed form to your error rate specialist and copy the regional office. An important note here is that multiple people can have access to the report. In fact, we recommend that more than one person in your state has the ability to at least enter data. One reason is that if one person with access happens to be out for the day, someone else can enter in the information for the report or access the report. So what we'll pull up now is the website. So here's the website for the OLDC. We recommend you use the Internet Explorer or Edge, although others have managed to use other browsers successfully. A two-factor authentication may be required. Some people seem to get it, others don't. This two-factor authentication involves an extra step. After you've entered your password, you'll either receive a request by text or to a call to the number that you provided. Now, another option to this is the use of the Google Authenticator app. The good news about this is that many people seem to get asked this extra step, but if you have any issues with it, you can email the app support, which is the email that will populate, the email that you see here. And if you have any issues with other technical items within OLDC, you can also utilize the same email to reach out for technical support. However, if you have any questions related to the report itself, the content of the report, you'll need to get in touch with the regional office and your error rate specialist. Now let's move to application launch. So once you've logged into the OLDC, you'll receive the application launch page, which looks like this screenshot. You will click on the OLDC, which is in the top right corner. And once you click on the OLDC homepage will open. Now, there are two versions of the OLDC homepage. The system defaults to the regular version, which is on the left side of your screen, but you can choose to switch to the enhanced version for your homepage, which is the one you see on the right. For the most part, there is not a significant difference between the two. The enhanced version has different capabilities on the home screen, but that's it. And the differences that you'll see are limited to the home screen. So once you click on a link to leave this page, there are no differences on the other pages in OLDC. Now let's move to creating and editing the ACF404 report. So regardless of whether you are looking at the regular or enhanced home screen, you'll get a list of links on the left side of your screen, which look like the screenshot that you see now. You're going to want to click on the top link, which is the report form entry. Completing this action will take you from the home page to the form selection page. The form selection page seen on your screen has a series of drop-down items. Now what we'll do now is we'll walk through the first 3 steps of the form selection page. So the first step on the form selection page is to select your program. Where it says program name, you'll choose Child Care and Development, Fund, Mandatory, and Matching. On this screenshot, that is the only option in the drop-down, but depending on your OLDC access capabilities, you may see additional options. And the next step, step 2, you will select the grantee name. Here you can see I have a lot of options, but you'll probably only see your state's name pop up. In some cases, there may be more than one grantee for your state. For example, in the picture, you'll see that Alaska has 2 grantees. So if that is the case for your state, you'll want to contact your regional office for assistance in determining which is the correct grantee. We ask that you don't guess, because we don't want you to enter in all of your data under the wrong grantee and then have to go back and re-enter everything under the correct one. Now, once you've selected or chosen the correct grantee, step 3 is to select your report. Again, in this drop-down, you may see more options depending on your role in OLDC. Regardless of that, for this particular webinar, you would want to select, you'll want to pick Program Performance Form ACF404, which is highlighted on your screen. So now let's begin creating the 404 report. So once you've selected the ACF404 report, then the box on your screen will pop up. This shows a list of review periods. These represent the case review periods for your cohort. The review period ran from 2019 to 2020. So to start the report, you will refer to the line for 10/1/2019 to 9/30/2020 and click the plus sign that you see here. Once you're on this page, you will also see the 404 reports prior reporting periods as well. These are available for you to view if you like. Now let's look at editing the 404 report. For cases in which you have started your 404 report, not completed it, and saved it, you can go back into the OLDC and edit your report. When you return to review the review period forms, there will be additional actions that you can take for the review period save. The different allowable actions are labeled with relevant icons. To go back in and edit, you will click on the icon that looks like a square with a pencil in it. The other icons, beginning with the second icon that looks like a graph, allows you to see the report status and history. And the next icon looks like a printer, will generate a printable version of the latest saved version of the report. And then the last icon, which looks like an eye, will also allow you to view the latest version. Now that we've covered the basic getting started activities, let's close this section with some OLDC tips. So here are some general tips for using OLDC. First, it's always an excellent idea to save your work often. Your work is not automatically saved in OLDC. And we all know that computers freeze up and occasionally crash. So we don't want you to get far along and then lose everything. Copy and paste. Every year, this is a bit of a mystery to us because some users are able to copy and paste their work just fine and others cannot. At any rate, we do recommend that you complete the report first in Word format, just so that you'll have a backup version. And hopefully, fingers crossed, you can copy and paste it into the OLDC. Now, before you're able to submit your report, you will need to click a button that says Validate. And Katie will show you a little later in the webinar about the validate. But when you validate, you will get a list of issues with the report, if there are any. Some of these are considered warnings, which you should just read and address if necessary. But the report can still be submitted with a warning. But if there are any errors, however, these must be fixed before submission. Once you have submitted, if you need to make changes, the designee will need to uncertify and unsubmit the report. That can be done from the report status page, which can be accessed from the box I showed you on the previous screen with the icons. And that's it for getting started with OLDC. Are there any questions on accessing OLDC and getting started?
I don't believe any questions have come in. So thank you, Janae, for the overview. If there are any questions, feel free to either raise your hand or use the questions box and we will address it shortly. But now during this next portion of the webinar, thanks again, Janae, we'll go through each of the parts and items on the report itself, the 404 report, and discuss how they're completed and how they will be entered in the OLDC website. So first, just to introduce the report a bit, and also we do have a copy of the report itself in the handouts box, and I also emailed it out to the registrants before the webinar if you want to take a look and follow along. But first, the first part is the program assurances and certifications. Then part 2 has the error measures, and this is where you enter the numbers, the quantitative measures. And finally, in part 3, you will enter your narrative responses. we're going to just start at the beginning, which is part 1, program assurances and certifications. And this section is very straightforward. This is a screenshot from the template just to show you what's included in the assurances and certifications. Obviously, I'm not going to read this all, but just what you need to know is that when you are in the OLDC, you will not need to fill out this data that's in the second, you can see on the bottom half. That's all going to be pre-populated for you. So you won't need to fill anything in here. We just ask that you, of course, read it and make sure you agree with everything. The certifier will just click on a link to e-sign. And also, even though this is part 1 of the report, this is actually done last. So when you go into the OLDC, you'll be part 2, you'll be part 3. Everything is going to be validated and entered and saved. This is kind of the last step before submission. So that's pretty easy and straightforward, I think. Now we'll move to part 2, which is the error measures. And before we dive into the items that make up part 2 of the 404 report, I want to take a step back and show you one of the elements from the record review worksheet. This is element 500. If you are someone that conducts reviews or supervises reviews, this probably looks pretty familiar to you. But if you're not super familiar with the record review worksheet, I'll give you a quick crash course in this element. For each of the case reviews that are conducted, the reviewer enters their findings into this part of the record review worksheet. So for instance, in item 1 here, the reviewer enters whether the case had an error or not. Item 2, they'll indicate whether, if there was an error, if it was missing or insufficient documentation. Items 2A through 2E, the reviewer provides some additional information about missing or insufficient documentation errors. Item 3 is where the reviewer records whether the case had an underpayment or overpayment. Item 4 is the amount of the improper payment, if there is one. And then item 5 is the total payment amount for the sample month. So the reason I'm showing you this is because the information that you're going to be entering in the 404 report is really kind of comes from this data. So you'll be reviewing and tallying up a lot of these figures from your case reviews. And so when I'm walking through the different 404 items in the next few slides, I'll be referencing these data points a lot. So let's start with the first few items that are on the 404 report. As I go through, I'll use some hypothetical numbers as an example to illustrate each item. And let's just start with the very beginning. Number 1, this is asking for your total number of cases samples, which is, I think, going to be 276 for everyone. And item 2 is going to ask for your total number of cases with an error. And this includes any error, not just those improper payment errors. And to determine this figure, you'll need to refer to your completed record review worksheet, just like we just talked about on the last slide. And you're going to tally up the total number of those 276 worksheets that had a 1 coded in element 500, column 2, number 1. Since that is where you code whether or not there was an error. So we're going to say in our example state that there were 45 cases that had an error. And then in item 3, this is asking for the percentage of cases that had an error. You can see here at the bottom of the screen, I have the formula to determine this. It's just what you wrote for, or what you entered for item 2 divided by item 1. But you don't actually have to do the math since this item is auto-calculated in the OLDC. So in our example state, the percentage of cases with an error is 16.3%. And I'm going to quick show you what this will look like in the OLDC so you can see how the auto-calculating kind of works. So this is the data collection page for the OLDC. Here are the numbers. I'm highlighting here the numbers for part 2 of the report. And I'm just going to enter 276 for item 1, number of cases sampled. For item 2, which again is the number of cases with an error, we said 45. And then you can see here for percentage of cases with an error, number 3, that you can't really enter anything. And in order to actually see that auto calculation, you're going to need to kind of scroll up to the top and hit save. And then when you come back, you can see that this math is done. And I'm not going to do this for all of the items, but I just wanted to kind of show you how this works. And as we go down to additional items on the 404, there are a number of others that are auto-calculated, and you'll be able to generate those in the same way. All right, so those are the first 3 items to kick us off. Let's move on to items 4 through 6. Item 4 asks for the number of cases that have an improper payment. This is going to be your total number of cases that have just a number other than 0 entered in number 4 of element 500 of your record review worksheet. So item 4 is where you record the improper payment amount. So if that amount is going to be anything other than 0, then that case would be included in the tally. Let's say that our state had 20 of those. This tally should not include any potential improper payments caused by missing or insufficient documentation that were mitigated through an additional inquiry. So if you had any of those and your case did not have any other improper payments, those would not, again, be included in this count. Item 5 is going to calculate automatically. This is the percentage of cases that had an improper payment, which again is going to be this whatever you entered in item 4 divided by 276, and that's 7.25%. And then item 6, number 6 is asking for the total number of cases with an improper payment due to missing or insufficient documentation, or MID. Similar to item 4, just be sure not to include those cases that had improper payment errors that were mitigated. So tally up the number of cases that had a Y in element 500, number 2 of your record review worksheet, and also had an improper payment, had a number other than 0 in number 4 of the record review worksheet, element 500. So in our example state, we're going to say that there were 8 cases with an improper payment error due to MID. Moving on along. So the next few items on the 404 ask for some additional information about missing or insufficient documentation errors. 7A is asking for the total number of MID, potential improper payment errors. Now this is different from the last few items that we talked about. We're not asking here for the number of cases, but the number of errors. So sometimes you see that a case has more than one MID error, and you want to make sure that you're counting the errors here. This includes all MID potential improper payment errors, whether they were mitigated or not, and whether you did an additional inquiry or not. This can be found by summing the figures in your record review worksheets, element 500, column 2, item 2A. And this is where you record the number of errors. So you would just sum up all of those figures. We'll say that our example state had 13 of those. Moving on to 7B, this represents the sum of the potential improper payments resulting from MID errors. So this would be your dollar figure before any additional inquiry mitigation. And it is the sum of the figures that you recorded in your record review worksheet, element 500, number 2B. Now, important note, you would apply the pooling factor here if pooled funds were used. Our state identified $3,440 in potential improper payments resulting from the MID errors. You'll notice here and in all of the items throughout the report that ask for dollar amounts, everything is rounded to the nearest whole number. So when you're working in the OLDC, if you do enter dollars and cents, they will be automatically rounded. Also, a quick note about the pooling factor. This is a new requirement this cycle to make sure that you apply pooling factor to certain items if you use one. And the purpose of this is just to get a more accurate representation of the actual CCDF dollars that were in error. And talk a little bit more about the pooling factor throughout the webinar, but if you have any questions about how to apply it to these items, feel free to reach out to us for some technical assistance. We're happy to help with that. All right, moving on to 8A. This is now asking for the total number of potential improper payment errors that were mitigated using the additional inquiries. And you can find this by summing up the figures that you entered on your record review worksheets, element 500, number 2D. In our example, we'll say that there were 5 potential improper payment errors that were mitigated. 8D is then asking for the total dollar amounts that were mitigated, and this is recorded in element 500, number 2E. So again, go back to your worksheets and just add all of those figures up. And similarly to the last slide, item 70, 8B is also an item where you're going to want to apply the pooling factor if pooled funds were used. And we'll say that our state had $1,320 of payments that were mitigated. Right, moving along to 9A and 9B, these items are actually both auto-calculated, so they're going to be pretty easy for you to do in the OLDC, but just to explain what they are. This is asking for the total number of mid-errors that remained because they could not be mitigated. So it really is just what you entered for 7A minus what you entered for 8A. So in our example state, we had 13 potential errors, 5 were mitigated, so that leaves us with 8. 9B is kind of the same idea. It's asking for the total dollar amount of improper payments that could not be mitigated. Again, this is just 7B minus 8B, and it's done for you in the OLDC. So we're left with $2,120 for our example. Okay, that's the last of the, I think, mid-specific items for now in part 2. So let's move on to item 10, and this is asking for the total amount of payments for the sampled cases. And this can be found again by, like almost everything else, going back to your record review worksheets and summing up the totals that were entered, summing up the figures that were entered in element 500, number 5. This is another item where you would apply the pooling factor if you have one. Our state had $124,850 in total payments for all of those 276 sampled cases. So item 11 is the total amount of improper payments for the review period, and this is the gross amount of underpayments and overpayments. This is another item that is auto-calculated, so I want to skip this for a moment because it is calculated by taking the sum of 11A and 11B. So I'll move on to 11B. This is asking for the total amount of underpayments for the review period. So here you're going to sum up the amounts entered in element 500, number 4 of the record review worksheet. But only for those that have a U entered in element 500, column 2, number 3, right? So if a case had an improper payment, it's going to have that improper payment amount in item 4 of your element 500. And then in item 3, it's going to say either O or U for overpayment or underpayment. So we just want those figures for those underpayment cases. Enter the pooling factor if pooled funds were used. And in our example state, there were $710 in underpayments. Item 11B, you might have guessed, is kind of the same thing, but for overpayments only. So it's the same idea. You're going to enter sum up the amounts that were entered in number 4 of element 500, column 2 of your record review worksheets for only those cases that had an O entered in element 500, column 2, number 3. This is another one where you would enter the pooling factor if necessary. Our example had $4,590 in overpayments. And once you've entered those two, the next time you hit save in the OLDC, then item 11 will be auto-populated. And again, it's just the sum of 11A and 11B. So that's going to be here $5,300. All right. Moving on, we have a few more items in part 2 of the 404 report. Item 12 is the percentage of the total amount of payments for the sampled cases that were improper payments. And this is the all-important error rate. It's calculated by dividing what you entered in the last item, your total amount of improper payments. Going to take that figure and divide it by your total amount of payments for all the sampled cases. It's auto-calculated for you. You can see that the math for our state was 4.25%. Item 13 is another one that is auto-calculated. It's asking for the average amount of improper payments. This again, you're going to start with the total number of, or the total amount of overpayments. Oh, sorry, total amount of improper payments, not just the overpayments. And dividing it by item 4, which asks you, if you recall, for the total number of improper payments. It's also going to be auto-calculated for you. So you don't need to do the math yourself, but it's always good to, have an idea of what goes into that math. The average amount here was $265. Right, moving on to 14A, this is the total amount of subsidy payments that were made using CCDF funds over the whole 12-month review period. And this means, this is asking for this includes all children, not just the sample. So this is going to be a large number. Back in your SSAT, we asked you how you're going to come up with this number. So hopefully you all, have a plan. You all have figured out, how you're going to pull this. Again, if you need any technical assistance, feel free to reach out to us. But again, it's going to be a big number. We're going to say 54 million, a little over 54 million for our state. And then 14B is the estimated annual amount of improper payments. This is applying that error rate that we determined back in number 12. Applying that to the figure that we just entered in 14A. So this is kind of extrapolating, what is going to be your estimated amount of improper payments for all of your payments that are made. It's auto-calculated for you, 2.3 million here in our example. Okay. So we just had a question come in, and I want to address it now because it's based on item 14A. So while we're on the subject, the question is the number entered in 14A the payments for the review year? So it's going to be the payments for the, for the review period, which again for the year 2 states ran from October of 2019 through September of 2020. So it's going to be all of those CCDF payments that were paid out during that 12-month period. And again, not just, for those 276 children in the sample, but for, everything, for everyone. Is the pooling factor applied? So this is just going to include, we want this figure to only include CCDF funds. So the pooling factor would not be applied because if you only have CCDF funds to begin with, you wouldn't want to, apply the pooling factor again. Now, depending on how you come up with the figure, it might be that you're starting out with a figure that includes a lot of different funds in the pool, and then you would want to apply it. I can't really say one way or the other how it's going to look for your state. It is definitely something that we can talk about one-on-one, though, if you want some help with that. But again, we don't want you to kind of pull the number just for the CCDF and then apply a pooling factor again, because then it's not going to be accurate. So yeah, we can talk about that more offline if it would be helpful. Sure. Okay. Good question. That's these are questions that I think end up coming up every year, so it's good to address them. Okay. Actually, let's keep talking about the pooling factor. Item 15 asks about, did you use a pooling factor? And you're going to have to check either A, B, or C. If your review was not based on a sample drawn from pooled funds, then it's going to be really easy. You just check A. If your review was based on a sample drawn from pooled funds and you used that pooling factor from your most recent ACF-800 reporting form, check B, and then provide the number and percentage of cases that used pooled funds. In most cases, in most states, the number of sample cases that use pooled funds is going to be 276, and the percentage is going to be 100%. But that's not the case in every state, just kind of depending on how things are, how your sample is funded and how that's all set up. So again, I'll say it again, yet again, that if you do need any assistance figuring all that out, let us know. If you used a pooling factor that was different from the one you gave on the most recent 800 reporting form, then you would check C and answer these 4 items. Let us know what is the pooling factor, how did you come up with it, and then give the number and percentage of sampled cases that use pooled funds. All right. Moving from the pooling factor and on to replacement cases. This is item 16. Asks for information on any replacement cases that were used. As a reminder, you must receive approval from the regional office to use any replacement case. For the sake of space, I'm only showing 2 months here from the template, but in the template, all 12 months are shown. We'll say that our state used the replacement case in October because it was discovered that no payment was actually made in the sample month and that there were 2 such cases in that month. Now, when you're working in the OLDC, I'll show you again how that looks. This is the item right here. There's a space to record the month. There's like a drop down. There's a few reasons that are pre-populated, but if it's something that doesn't fall under here, you can just say other and write down that reason, like no payment made. If your reason is one of the drop downs, then you don't have to write anything in this box. And then you just include the number of times that reason was used. You also have the capability here to add more rows if you have more than one month and reason. So you just click the number of additional rows that you want, hit add. If you added a row in error, you can click this box that says delete and just click the box here for delete marked rows. So I don't see any other questions that came in for part 2, so we can move on to part 3, the narrative responses. And just also, I'm going to throw this out here right now. I know Leanne will mention it again at the end, but just because I feel like we have to go through this really fast, for the sake of time, we do have ARA office hours tomorrow. So if there's any questions here that are unclear, if you want me to go in depth on any of these, please feel free to join us tomorrow and we can expand on anything in this webinar. So, all right. The first of the narrative items is item 17. And this is asking to describe your lessons learned or improvements made in implementing the review process this cycle. So here, you can describe what you learned as you implemented your SDAP. What did you do this cycle that was different from the prior cycle? And I think for everyone, this cycle was really different from last time because of the pandemic. So what did you kind of need to do differently this time around? How did policy changes, COVID-related policy changes affect things? Just anything that you changed along the way in your plans or process, anything that was unexpected, and so on. In the OLDC, this is just like a text box that you'll copy and paste or write your answer into. In item 18, you'll provide some information about those potential improper payment errors that were due to MID, missing or insufficient documentation. You must provide these data points for all of the potential improper payment errors that were due to MID, regardless of whether an additional inquiry was used and regardless of whether the error was mitigated. So there is a lot going on in this item, but the good news is that everything can be easily pulled from your MID tables. And I will show you on the next slide. I'll show and then I'll come back to this point that I have in the yellow box. But so we have a table format here for item 18. You can see that there's columns A through F. Column A is straightforward. You're just going to take your mid-tables, your completed mid-tables, and for each of those rows that are completed, you're going to enter the element number that had the mid error. Column B asks what was the mid. So what was the missing or insufficient documentation? And this can be pulled from column 2 on your mid table. That item asks to describe what was missing or insufficient. So whatever you provided there in your mid table, you can just copy and paste it over to column B here for item 18. C is the dollar amount of the potential improper payment, and this corresponds to column 3 in the mid-table. D corresponds to columns 4, 5, and 6 of the mid-table. So in your completed mid-table, column 4 asks whether an additional inquiry can be used, and you'll say either yes or no. You describe why not in column 5 if you said no, and if you say yes, you describe what the additional inquiry was in column 6. So here in column D, you're going to say, again, either yes or no, and then pull the rest of your response from either column 5 or 6, depending on which one you filled out in the mid-table. Column E, the amount mitigated, corresponds to column 8 of the mid-table. How much was mitigated? And then column 9, column F corresponds to column 9. So that's where you explain how you determine whether or not the potential improper payment could be mitigated. So for example, pretend that one of your record review worksheets had a potential improper payment error caused by MID in element 330. So you're going to take that MID table and just kind of bring all that information over into here. The error was in 330. The child citizenship verification was missing. Again, that was pulled from column 2. The potential improper payment was 510. Moving to column D, the yes was pulled from column 4 of the mid-table, and then the description, contacting vital records, was pulled from column 6. In column E, the entire dollar amount of 510 was mitigated, and in column F, there's a brief description that the vital records was able to provide the birth certificate. One more quick example, I won't go into this one in detail, but I just wanted to show you that in this particular example, the potential improper payment error was not mitigated. So columns E and F, which asks for how much was mitigated and how. That's going to be blank because you're not going to have any information on your mid table to pull into those columns. One quick note, I'm going to go back to the previous slide, is that, again, for each error, for each mid potential improper payment error, you're going to have a row here in item 18. It's very, in the OLDC, it looks very similar to the replacement case item where you can just kind of add rows, delete rows if you need to. The note that I have here in the yellow box, the number of lines here that you have is going to equal that number that you entered back in 7A, because that's asking for the number of potential mid errors you have. So if you entered, 15 in item 7A, then you're going to want to make sure that you have 15 rows here entered in item 18. So that's just something that you can quick check before you, save and submit your report. It's something that we're going to check too. So, just make sure that all kind of adds up, aligns with each other. Right. So moving on to item 19, we ask that you identify all of the causes of your improper payment errors. If you were involved last cycle with this, you may recall that in the old version of the 404, you only had to provide the two most common mid and the two most common non-mid causes. This time around, we are asking for everything. So for each error cause, you're going to provide that cause, the number of cases that have that cause, an example, and then whether it was mid or not. So again, it's set up like a table where you can add rows to it in the OLDC. Say that income calculation was one of your error causes. You can say that there were 12 cases with this error and give a brief example, like all sources of income were not included. And then say, no, this was not caused by mid. So a couple of things to keep in mind. First, as I have in the yellow box here, the sum. So the sum of the second column here is going to be greater or equal to the number of IP cases that you entered in number 4. So we would expect, some cases can have more than one error cause in it. So that's fine if this number ends up being more than the number that you entered in item 4, but it should not in any case be less. Also, make sure you're not including any potential improper payment errors that were mitigated. And also make sure that you are separating out mid from non-mid. So let me show you an example. In the second row, I have need for care as a cause because work verification was missing from the file. That's a mid error. But we also sometimes see need for care as a non-mid error, right? For example, the worker calculated needs incorrectly. There was no missing documentation. It was just kind of a worker error with calculation. So it's kind of the same cause or the same category, need for care, but we want to see that if it's a mid error and a non-mid error that they are separated out for here. So make sure that those would end up on different rows. Item 20, again, asks for a list of the error causes. And here you'll give your plans for reducing the errors. You'll describe action steps, timelines, the methods you'll use to measure progress, and the methods that you'll use to measure the progress and impact of your action steps. So I'm going to show you this a little more in depth here. Again, it's a table. The first column just kind of numbers the errors 1, 2, and 3. The next column, cause of error, is going to auto-populate based on your response to item 19. So again, like income calculation, need for care. Need for care is on there twice because one is mid and one is non-mid. The next column is action steps, and here we ask that you share specific activities that you're going to plan to help reduce that error. That should not say income calculation there, so I apologize for that. That's a typo. Next column, timeline, share when those action steps will be taken and when you anticipate they'll be complete. And finally, in the column for progress measurement, describe how you'll track both completion of your action steps and whether they're having the desired effect in reducing the error. A few more pointers on this item. If you have an error cause with more than one action step, we recommend that you kind of number those action steps and then have corresponding numbering in the subsequent columns for timeline and progress measurement. That just makes it very clean and easy to follow. If you have any error causes this cycle that were also error causes last cycle, we want you to specifically address what's going to be done differently this time around. And these last 2 points I have here kind of are tie into each other, but just make sure that your action steps are directly tied to error causes. Sometimes we see very generic responses, and it works sometimes, but it's not usually. You want to make sure that really your action steps are addressing the specific error causes, and also make sure that the timeline and progress measurements just all tie together too. So make sure you're giving us some specific information and not just kind of generic responses here. Moving on to 21, this is a two-part question. For 21A, enter the amount of improper payments that you expect to recover. And if the amount that you expect to recover is less than the amount of overpayments, that's fine, but we just want you to describe why. What are some of the reasons? Consider your history of collecting overpayments and any state laws that might limit the collection amount, just to make sure that you're giving us an accurate kind of estimation here. And in 21B, enter the amount that was collected as a result of the previous review. And if it was less than the amount that you expected to recover, describe the reasons why. So you'll need to refer to item 18A on your last report to see what that expected amount was. Remember, you can access last report on the OLDC, or if you have trouble accessing it, you can always reach out to us and we can send that to you. Again, that was item 18A in the old report. Item 22 is where you describe your information system and other infrastructure. What systems that help with eligibility, that help to identify and reduce errors, or that help with the improper payment process. And it doesn't explicitly say this in the item description, but if you have any limitations or you can describe that here. Or if you have any plans to acquire additional systems or update what you already have, you can also describe that here as well. So that one's pretty straightforward. In 23, this is where you provide a series of targets and findings from the current and previous cycle, and also your future targets for a series of data points, percentage of cases with an error, percentage of cases with improper payment, percentage of improper payments, your average amount of improper payments, and then the estimated annual amount of improper payments. So this sounds like a lot of data points, and it is, but a lot of it does get just pre-populated. It's set up like a table in the OLDC where you have the error measures kind of listed on the left. The figures for prior cycle data, prior cycle target, and current cycle target are all going to auto-populate based on what you entered in the last report. And the figures for the current cycle data will also auto-populate, again, based on what you entered in the current report. So based on what you entered in part 2 of the report. So really the only new data, I guess, that you'll need to provide are your targets for next cycle. And obviously we do like to see progress with your targets. We like to see numbers get smaller, but we also want you to obviously be realistic. So kind of find that balance there is kind of what we like to see. In item 24, you'll be comparing your current cycle data to those targets that you set last cycle. And if any of them were not met, tell us why, and refer to your action steps that you described and how specifically will those action steps address the areas where targets were not met. And then this is the last item in the 404 report, item 25. So here you'll be thinking back to the improper payment error causes identified in your last report from 3 years ago, 2018. And you're going to, for each of those error causes, describe what action steps you took and whether they reduced the error causes, how you measured progress, and were there any barriers to the effectiveness of the action steps. So I'm going to show you some more of this on the next slide. Again, it's a table in the OLDC. The first column is again going to pre-populate based on what you entered for your error causes last cycle. In the next column, you'll want to take a look at your 404 report back from 2018, specifically item 17. That's where you listed your planned action steps. Were those implemented? Did you have any additional action steps that were taken? And you can describe that here. In the next column, did the action steps reduce the identified errors? You can simply say yes or no here. You can provide additional information, but yes or no is fine too. And then next column, how did you measure your progress? Again, you might wish to refer to item 17 in your last report since plans for measurement were included there. So that might be a good starting point, but if what you actually did differed from your plans, then you want to describe what you actually did do. All right, and then in the last column, describe any barriers or setbacks in implementing the action steps. So maybe you did implement things, but you didn't see the intended results. You can say that here as well. If you didn't have any barriers, if things went great, you can just say none here. All right, now we only have a few minutes left, and I'm going to hand it over to Leanne in a moment, but just really quickly, I want to bring up the OLDC one more time to show you a couple other things here. Once you have entered everything, there's a series of buttons. These are the same, the bottom of the screen and the top of the screen, these 4 buttons. We talked a little bit about validation. I think Janae talked about that back at the beginning of the webinar. So once you've entered everything, remember to save often. When you're all done, you'll hit validate, and that is the point where it will let you know if there's any errors or warnings. If everything turns out good, then there'll be another button that comes up for certifying and then submitting. You probably don't need to add any attachments, but if you do, there's a box here to view and then add or view any existing attachments. You also have the option to print. All right, so only a couple minutes left, but I'm going to give it back to Leanne to take us through a couple of next steps.
All right, thank you, Katie. I didn't see any other questions come in. There's no hand raised, so we're just going to keep on moving along. Over the next few weeks, as you all are preparing that 404 report, your error rate TA team is here to provide support as needed and requested. Now, here at the end, we're trying to wrap up quickly, but if there are any lingering questions, or maybe tomorrow you pull up the OLDC, take a look at the 404, you have some questions. Tomorrow we have an error rate office hours, same time, 3 o'clock Eastern. You can hop in at any time during those office hours. It's an opportunity a little bit more informally to ask questions and share information with your state peers. Again, hop on anytime during that hour. As you begin to fill out your 404 reports and maybe have questions or difficulties with any of the items, we can help. We can review a draft report before you submit, and sometimes having this quick TA review and feedback can expedite the approval process. So if there's time for a review of your draft report, we are happy to do it for you. We also offer a just-in-time training. This is a one-on-one TA session on completing your report. and entering it into the OLDC. This training really varies state to state, and it will be set up to meet your needs. Very flexible on what sorts of TA and how that looks for your state. And to request TA, please reach out to your regional office, or you can email your error rate specialist, Janae, Katie, or myself. And of course, if you do email us directly, please copy your regional office. Next steps for our year twos. If you haven't already, please make sure you get your OLDC access set up. We do recommend at least 2 individuals per state have the necessary access, especially when it comes to summer and vacations and making sure there's some coverage there. Begin working on your 404 report. And if you would like to have any type of training or TA, please just let us know so we can get that scheduled with you. And of course, the final bullet, please submit your ACF404 report by June 30th. All right, we are at just over the hour, but if there are any final questions, we will hang on, stay on the line and answer them. Otherwise, thank you all. Thank you for hanging in there for our cohort call today. And we look forward to hearing from you with any questions that may come up as you're gearing up to submit.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow at office hours. We've enjoyed working with this cohort, and look forward to getting these 404s in and approved.
Thanks, everyone.